Hello and welcome to Topic 5, Lecture 2, and in this we're going to focus on the gender gap in representation in Congress. All right, so this week we're going to be engaging in a really fun discussion about the gender gap in Congress. And so in that discussion, you're going to be explaining why there is a gender gap in Congress, some of the strategies for closing it, and whether the gender gap between men and women and who represents us in Congress, it matters, whether it's something we should be concerned about. So this lecture is sort of just a foundations lecture. I just want to make sure, since we're going to be talking about representation in Congress, I want to make sure that everybody understands what the United States Congress is, and also to give a quick overview of the description, an overview and a description of the gender gap in representation in Congress. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so as we talked about earlier in the semester, there are three branches of government in the United States government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary. And this week we're going to be learning about the gap in gender representation within the legislative branch, in particular in the U.S. Congress. And so I know a lot of you already know this, but so I'll go quickly, but in case you don't, or in case you need a refresher, the United States Congress is composed of two branches, okay, or two chambers within the legislative branch. One of the chambers is known as the U.S. House of Representatives. Sometimes it's referred to just as the House, and the other is the United States Senate. So let's first focus on the United States House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is much bigger than the other chamber, the Senate. The House of Representatives has 435 members. That number is set by federal law. It's not in the Constitution. It can change, get larger or smaller, but right now it's set at 435. It's been that number for quite some period of time. And each member of the House of Representatives serves a 2-year term, so they're frequently up for re-election. And the number of representatives each state gets is based on their population. So the larger, in terms of the more populous your state is, the more members of the House you get. But each state, regardless of how small it is, you could have 20 people living in a state and you would still get one member for the House of Representatives. And so because, that members in the House represent a particular district, and we'll talk about that in a second, that members of the House, are focused more on local issues. So if you if you're the representative for the 4th Congressional District in Wisconsin, that's a very urban congressional district. And so that representative is going to be focused on urban issues, whereas some of the other congressional districts in Wisconsin are very rural and agricultural. And so those representatives are going to focus on those issues. It's also a prestigious job, no doubt, but it's less prestigious than being in the Senate. Wisconsin gets 8 members for the House of Representatives, and so we have 8 congressional seats. Of those 8, 5 of the Wisconsin representatives are Republicans, and 3 are Democrats. Even though for the most part our state is evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, as you know, because our elections are really close. But that's the way the House seats break down. These are likely to be your members of Congress depending on where you live. So if you live in the Milwaukee area or up in Whitefish Bay along sort of the coast of Lake Michigan, it's likely that your U.S. rep for the House of Representatives is Gwen Moore. She's a Democrat, and she represents the 4th Congressional District of Wisconsin. If you live in Waukesha, chances are you live in the Wisconsin 5th Congressional District, and that would be true if you live in West Bend as well. And it's likely, if you live in those areas, your representative is Scott Fitzgerald, who's a Republican. If you live south of Waukesha, it's possible, and towards Kenosha, it's possible that you could live in the Wisconsin 1st Congressional District and your representative would be Brian Steele, okay? That all the seats for the election are up for the U.S. House of Representatives. All of those seats are up for re-election in the midterm election. And in Wisconsin, talking about gender, we only have one female member of the House contingent from Wisconsin, and that's Gwen Moore. The rest of the representatives from Wisconsin are men. The U.S. Senate is a much smaller chamber than the House. Each state gets two senators, and so that means that there are 100 senators in the U.S. Senate. They also serve a much longer term. While members of the House serve a 2-year term, members of the Senate serve a 6-year term. It is a more prestigious chamber to serve in, and oftentimes people will move up from the House of Representatives to then serve in the Senate. And also the Senate is generally more national focused, and also because senators have to represent a state, that they can't focus on specific issues that are pertinent to their own House district. They have to kind of look beyond that. In Wisconsin, we have 2 senators, obviously. We have one who's a Democrat and one who is a Republican. We also have one male representative, or Senator Johnson, and female Tammy Baldwin. And Tammy Baldwin is not up for re-election in the midterm elections, but Ron Johnson is. And so he's up for re-election at the November 8th midterm elections. So as you know from the previous lecture, that every 2 years we have a federal election. That our next presidential election is in 2024, and that's when the President of the United States is elected to serve a 4-year term. And then that every other year, so that we have the midterm elections. So for example, we had a presidential election in 2020. It was Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. Joe Biden won. The midterm election in a few weeks is in 2022. It's halfway between the presidential elections. And in that, in a midterm election, all the members of the House are up for re-election and 1/3 of the Senate. The difference between a midterm and a presidential election is that the president is up for election at that point as well. So all members of the House are up for re-election in both the presidential election and the midterm elections. That only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election in presidential elections and midterm elections due to their 6-year term. Members can serve as long as they not as long as they want, but as long as their constituents continue to re-elect them. There are no term limits in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. There is a term limit, obviously, for the president. They can only serve 2 4-year terms. So every 2 years, a new session of Congress begins. And the reason for that is because we elect new members of Congress every 2 years. Every 2 years that the new Congress is seated, and that those sessions of those 2-year sessions of Congress are numbered. So, and a session of Congress is 2 years long. So we're currently in the 117th U.S. Congress. It was seated on January 3rd, 2021. That was after the presidential election in November in 2020. And this Congress will remain seated until January 3rd, 2023. And at that point, the 118th Congress will take over. So which party is in control of the 117th Congress? Well, the answer to that question is the Democrats. The Democrats have a majority in both the U.S. House of Representatives and in the Senate, but it is a very slim majority. Currently in the U.S. Senate, there are 50 Republicans, there are 48 Democrats, and there are 2 independent senators, but they caucus with the Democrats. So for all practical purposes, they vote with the Democrats. So it's a tie. And as you may or may not know, that when there is a tie in the vote in the Senate, the tie-breaking vote goes to the president of the Senate, and the president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. So Vice President Kamala Harris breaks a tie. She's a Democrat, so that's why the Democrats have a very slim majority in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, the Democrats also have the majority there. There are 220 Democrats, 212 Republicans. Right now, there are 3 vacancies. Democrats have about a 51% majority in the House of Representatives. Again, very slim. And when you compare the number of seats, so the Democrats took over the House of Representatives in 2018, although the Senate was still in the hands of the Republicans. And so that was a real vibrant pickup for the Democrats in 2018. In 2020, the Democrats actually lost 11 seats. And we don't know, but the projections for the midterm elections are that it's likely that the Democrats are going to lose the House of Representatives. But on the flip side, projections are showing that Democrats are likely to continue to hold the majority in the U.S. Senate. But we'll see what happens come November 8th. Okay, now that you have a brief primer on the United States Congress, let's move in and take a look at representation within Congress, because that's what you're going to be learning about this week in your discussion. So to do that, we're going to take a look at the demographics of Congress. In other words, what is the racial composition of Congress? What is the age composition? What is the gender composition? And even what's the party composition? There's lots of ways that we can think about the demographics or the social markers within the United States Congress. And one thing we want to keep in mind, since Congress is supposed to represent the people of the United States, we have to ask ourselves, well, is Congress representative of the people that it's actually representing? In other words, does the United States Congress demographically look like the demographics of the general population of the United States? As we're going to see, it is not demographically representative. And I've got a graph to take a look at that in a moment. But the question is does it matter? Does racial and gender and ideological diversity, does that matter? And that's what you're going to be discussing this week in discussion, in particular as it relates to gender parity. And if it does matter that Congress, if you think that it does matter that Congress should look like the United States and should be demographically representative, what efforts might we take to make Congress more diverse, or in other words, to make Congress more representative of the broader population? All right, so this graph shows you a demographic breakdown of the United States Congress. And this is from my American Government textbook, and that's the source of it. And the way that you read this graph, and let me put on my magic pen right here, is that there are two half circles, right? Here, here, and here. And the biggest half circle, okay, that is the general population of the United States. The middle half circle, that's the population of the U.S. House of Representatives. And the inner half circle, that is the demographic makeup of the Senate, okay? So let's first start with party, okay? And so this is the party makeup of the general party population of the United States. That it's about less than a third Republican, about a third Democrats, and about a third of independents, right? So about a third, okay? This is the party makeup of the House, okay? It is, almost half and half, more Democrats than Republicans, but no independents, right? And in the Senate, 2 independents, okay? So one could say that when it looked at party affiliation, that the United States Congress really isn't representative because it doesn't give voice to those who identify with a party other than the Democrats or the Republicans. Let's look then at gender. And obviously, this is what you're going to be talking about in your discussion. So in the United States, that there are more females than there are males, okay? And so they've got the females in pink, of course, and blues in male. And so there are about 51% of the U.S. population is women, 49% of the U.S. population is men. But then this is the House and the Senate, okay? And so a little bit more than a quarter of the House is women and a little bit more than a quarter. So that's a pretty big gap in terms of gender representation. Here is race, and so that 60% of about 61% of the US population is white, and 39% of the US population is non-white. Okay. And so we see that when we compare the demographics of the House and the Senate, that it is not representative racially. That 89% of the Senate is white, and 70, so that's the Senate, and 73% of the House is white. Okay. And then this is religion, that, somewhat proportional. And then, military service, law degrees, very many people in Congress have law degrees, not surprising. More people have served in the military in Congress than in the Gen Pop, but there's some parity there. And people who serve in Congress, not surprisingly, are older than the general population, but that's because there are age requirements to serve in the House. You have to be 25, and to serve in the Senate, you need to be 30. So this gives you kind of an overview of the demographic breakdown of the Congress as compared to the general population of the United States. So advances have been made in terms of diversity, in terms of having a Congress that looks more like the demographics of the United States, but there's still obviously a way to go. 77% of Congress is white, while only 60% of the US population is white. 51% of the US population is women, and even though great strides have been made in the last 10 years or so, still we only have 27% of the members of Congress who are women. When it comes to openly LGBTQ representatives, 2% of the House and 2% of the Senate are openly LGBTQ. That's less than what is in the general population, but it's a relatively small gap. And in the state of Wisconsin, we have 2 openly gay representatives, Mark Pocan and Senator Tammy Baldwin. Right now in Congress, there are currently no transgender members, although that will likely change in the future. So this graph shows you a visualization of the number of men and women in Congress. And so from 1917 to 2018. And so pretty stagnant for quite some time. Then we begin to close the gap a little bit starting in the 1990s, which we'll talk about in a moment. And, this is from 2017, so it's closed even still, but there's still a significant gap in terms of gender. So this is a graph that, shows from 1917. It's a similar way of looking at this, but it just shows the women's representation in Congress. And so, that this is where we are today. This is the 117th Congress. And as we've noted, 27% of the women in Congress are female. And then it breaks down. You can see that the vast majority of, and not surprisingly so, but the vast majority of women in Congress affiliate with the Democratic Party. But, there's a significant number of women who are Republican lawmakers as well. I want to draw attention, and I'll put my magic pen on here, to this year right here. And, here we see this it's like a leap year. And it's a leap year for a reason. This is 1992. And that it was at that point that it was the first year that we saw 6 women elected to Congress at once. So it was a huge deal. There had never been that many women elected at one time in a congressional election. Not only that, but it was the first time that one state, California, was represented by 2 women members of the Senate, Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein, who's still actually in the Senate. What happened this year? Well, what happened that year was the confirmation of Clarence Thomas in 1991, and the hearings, the Clarence Thomas hearings. That was a hearing where Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment, and that it became a very big issue in the United States. And what was interesting is that there were no women on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that's the committee that is in charge of recommending to the broader Senate whether that individual should be confirmed to be a Supreme Court justice. And so, history has it that there were a lot of women who were in politics at that time, either in local politics at the state legislative level or in the House. And they looked at the panel of all men and the questioning of Anita Hill and the legitimacy of her claims regarding harassment. And women in politics sat back and they said, how might that have been different if there had been women on that Senate Judiciary Committee? And that led women to run for office, and we see this leap here. And it's continued to increase ever since. We also see increasing diversity in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. We see that increasing as well in Congress. And to the point that the House of Representatives today is almost, it's in parity with the general population of African Americans. So when you look at the U.S. population, 13% of the U.S. population is African American. In the House, it's 12%, so really closed the gap, but the gap is still pretty significant in the Senate, which is only 3% African American. Where we see a big lag is that even though we do see an increase in the number of Latino representatives in Congress, Latinos make up a larger portion of the U.S. population, 18%, and in the House, only 10% of the House is Latino and 5% in the Senate. So again, increasing diversity, but still gaps to be closed. All right, well, hopefully this lecture has given you sort of a foundation that you'll need when thinking about this question in your discussion this week. I hope you enjoy the readings for this week's discussion. They look at the impact of the lack of parity, gender parity, and also strategies for closing the gap and what causes the gap as well. Thanks for paying attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.